Good morning, YouTubers. Throughout this series, I've made numerous mentions of the Magnavox Odyssey, usually adding how I'll discuss it in a future episode. Wow, they really don't make them like they used to. The only other console that comes close to something like that was the Magnavox Odyssey. Pong, another great guess. While that was the first Atari arcade game to be released and extremely successful, it was not the first video game. Ah, I see what you did there. Game number 1 for the Magnavox Odyssey. Nice. Unfortunately, no. And while this was the first home console on the market, I'll take a look at the Odyssey a later time. And 3, it's about as interactive as messing with your alarm clock. Instead of utilizing the capabilities of the 3DO, this game barely takes advantage of what could have easily been a game on the Magnavox Odyssey. Well, the time has come, and now I'm finally going to explore the origins of this groundbreaking console. To begin, I have to take you back to 1922 Germany, and a town on the border with France called Promesens. In 1922, Leo Baer, a worker in the local shoe factory, and his wife Lot welcomed a son into the world. Rudolf Heinrich Baer was born into a typical Jewish family living on the border of Germany and France during 1920. Around the time young Rudolf was born, an anti-Semitic culture was beginning to form in Germany, eventually giving rise to a charismatic speaker and his political party that promised to bring Germany back to their definition of greatness after its defeat in World War I. Using both the pen and the sword, the Nazi Party eventually rose to control both Germany's political system and its military. While I could dive deeper into this topic, I think Spielberg does much better justice with the storytelling aspect of this part of history. In 1936, at age 14, young Rudolf was kicked out of his school because of his Jewish ancestry and was forced to attend an all-Jewish school. Like many Jewish families at the time, the Baer family understood the current political situation in Europe all too well, and in 1938 successfully made arrangements to leave Germany for the United States. Within 2 years of settling in New York City, the Baer family became naturalized American citizens. Due to what was probably anti-German attitudes in America during World War II, young Rudolf changed his name to Ralph Henry Baer. Young Ralph actually secured a job at a New York factory, earning $12 a week making various leather accessories. One day while riding the subway, an advertisement caught Baer's attention. It was for a course in the new growing field of electronics. This area of study immediately captured his imagination, and he actually quit his job at the factory to pursue this study. In 1940, Baer graduated from the National Radio Institute as a radio service technician. Not long after, America would enter World War II, and by 1943, Baer was drafted and was assigned to military intelligence in London. After World War II ended in 1945, Baer took full advantage of the opportunities the GI Bill provided and earned his Bachelor's of Science in Television Engineering at the American Television Institute of Technology in Chicago. Upon graduating in 1949, Baer began working for Wappler Incorporated, designing and building a variety of electromedical equipment. Within 2 years, Baer took a job at Lohr Electronics as a senior engineer. Lohr Electronics was a defense contractor located in the Bronx that specialized in radar and sonar detection methods for the United States Navy. Baer's job at Lohr involved designing power line carrier signal equipment for IBM. Baer's stay at Lohr was brief, and within a year he began work as a chief engineer at Transition Incorporated, where he eventually became vice president before departing in 1956. It was at this point that Baer briefly started his own company before finally settling in with defense contractor Sanders Associates in Nashua, New Hampshire. Baer's main responsibility at Sanders was to supervise 500 engineers who were developing electronic systems for the military. 10 years after starting at Sanders, Baer wanted to propose an old idea from his brief days at Laurel 15 years earlier. In his initial 4-page proposal to his supervisors, Baer described a device that could be connected to a television set, and through the use of controllers, players would compete against each other in some sort of game seen through the television. When Baer originally envisioned this device 15 years earlier, television was still relatively new technology, and the vast majority of homes did not have television sets. According to the Library of Congress, fewer than 10% of households owned a television in 1951, but within a decade, more than 90% had televisions in their homes. By 1966, Baer realized it was now or never if he was going to develop his home video game console, and in August of that year, he wrote a 4-page proposal describing his idea. At this time, there was still no video game market. The only games developed were on large supercomputers and mainframes on university campuses. To learn more about the first video game ever made, check out my earlier video on the subject. In his proposal, Baer referred to his idea as the Channel LP, short for Let's Play. Since his employer Sanders typically dealt with military technology, this home consumer electronics device was not even something they had ever dealt with before, especially for Baer's desired price of just $20. Knowing that the Sanders executives were unlikely to approve of such a domesticated home project with little or no military implications, Baer found an empty room and recruited technician Bob Tremblay to help develop a prototype. By December of 1966, the duo produced a working prototype that could display and move a vertical line on a television screen. Feeling much more confident, Baer demonstrated their prototype to Herbert Campman, the director of research and development at Sanders. Campman wasn't exactly head over heels enthusiastic about the prototype, but he did agree to fund the project with $2,500, most of which went towards labor costs. With this funding, the Channel LP, now dubbed TV Game No. 1, was finally an official project. After spending a couple months and building just as many more prototypes, Baer enlisted technician Bill Harrison to begin the process of building the project into a working, manufacturable machine. While Harrison was doing that, Baer teamed up with engineer Bill Roush to design the console. They also tasked themselves with developing the first games for the system. By June of 1967, Campman was presented with a new working prototype that included a light gun shooting game, as well as a game where two players chased each other around by controlling the square dots on the screen. Campman enjoyed these games and increased the team's funding, as well as recommending they present this to the senior management. While this seemed promising, when Baer actually did present this to the Sanders senior management, most seemed unimpressed. However, a couple of board members showed enthusiasm for the project. Despite most of the board not seeing it as a potential successful commercial product, CEO Rowan Sanders approved the continuation of the project with increased funding. CEO Sanders believed there was at least some value at selling or licensing the technology to another company. With another prototype successfully produced in August of 1967, the cost of what it would take to manufacture and sell this gaming system became a reality, and Baer's desire to keep it at around $20 was a pipe dream that was never going to be achievable with the technology of that time. Baer also had hit a brick wall when it came down to designing fun games for it. To remedy this, he brought back Bill Roush to help design more games for the project. Baer reportedly told author Tristan Donovan during research for his book that Roush would show up to work late, putz around for an hour, take 2-hour lunch breaks, essentially doing as little work as possible on the project. Despite these bad habits, Roush proved his worth by proposing the idea that would make the system both fun and marketable. Roush proposed adding a third, system-controlled dot that would act as sort of a ball, like in a game of ping pong. This implementation of computer-controlled third dot would prove to be the nexus of video games that's still used today. While other computer programmers of the era had already developed leisurely computer programs that already did this, those programs were written for large supercomputers of the time. Nothing like this existed in the home market. By November of 1967, a fourth prototype was produced. By this point, Baer and his team felt like the machine was ready enough to start finding a manufacturer for it. With this fourth prototype, a joystick controller, a 3-dial controller, and a light gun had been developed, with games to utilize each controller's purpose. Since Sanders was a military contractor not set up to manufacture and distribute a domestic commercial product like this, the process of finding another company to buy this new TV game system and to distribute it officially began. The first company that showed interest was the Teleprompter Corporation, but financial woes forced Teleprompter to back out of any potential deal in April of 1968. During the same time, Sanders was also facing financial problems of their own and ended up laying off much of their staff. Despite this, the team was still able to develop a fifth prototype, but soon after the completion of this latest prototype, the entire project was put on hold. One thing to take into account were all the events occurring in America and the world during 1968.
The Viet Cong simultaneously attacked just about every major city and town in South Vietnam. In one day, they increased the scope of the war dramatically.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've kept the air on because we've heard an alarming report that Robert Kennedy was shot in that ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles.
And what happened? Police charged the crowd. I didn't think I'd get hit because, like, I'm a medic. I mean, like they said, medic, I'll give you a medic. And then they beat me.
The 1968 games will also be remembered for the 200-meter final. On the final straight, Tommy Smith powered past teammate John Carlos, who had to be content with bronze behind Australia's Peter Norman. The drama of the race was nothing compared to what happened next. During the medal ceremony, Smith and Carlos raised a single gloved fist as a symbol of protest at the treatment of blacks in the USA. They were ordered out of the Olympic Village and were suspended by the U.S. Olympic Committee.
Silver Star, the third highest medal in the country. It doesn't mean anything. Bob Sneal died for these medals. Lieutenant Pomerol died so I got a medal. Sergeant John died so I got a medal. I got a Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 air medals, National Defense, and the rest of this garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office.
That I will faithfully execute the office.
By January of 1969, the 7th prototype was completed. This one was encased in a box with wood grain panel stickers decorating its casing. The brown box, as is now being known as, was pitched to television manufacturers. An executive at RCA named Bill Enders saw the brown box's potential and began striking a deal with Baer and Sanders. In the end, however, no agreement could be reached. But that didn't stop Bill Enders, who left RCA and joined Magnavox, where he convinced them to take a second look at the new technology.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In July of 1969, while the world was watching in awe at Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first men to walk on the moon, Baer and his co-creators made another demonstration of the brown box to Magnavox. Like last time, most of the board's reaction showed little, if any, enthusiasm. Magnavox Vice President of Marketing, Jerry Martin, was impressed enough to convince the rest of the board to take a gamble and invest. After a long period of negotiations between Sanders and Magnavox, by January 1971, an agreement had finally been reached. Magnavox took the liberty of redesigning the casing and re-engineering some internal components with advice from both Baer and Harrison. Some notable changes included making the console display strictly black and white, as opposed to the prototypes that had displayed color, as well as using only a 3-dial controller and modifying the circuitry to read games from separate game cards, as opposed to selecting games via a dial. During the testing phase, marketing originally named the console the Skill-O-Vision, which in terms of marketing was consistent with various product names of the 1960s and 70s. Marketing eventually settled on the name Odyssey, with a suggested retail price of $99.99. Adjusted for inflation in 2018, that's about $600. In September of 1972, Ralph Baer's vision of a video game console was about to come to fruition, but like his console's namesake, Baer's own Odyssey was only just beginning.
Bob, would you explain what it is we have here? How does Odyssey work?
Well, basically, Odyssey is an electronic beam simulator that you attach to your television to create a totally new play and learning experience.
When the Odyssey debuted, Pong was still months away from being released for the first time, and the term video game still hadn't even been coined yet. In 1972, Magnavox actually had their own stores located throughout the United States, and this was how many consumers actually obtained an Odyssey. While the retail price for one was $99.99, consumers had the option of purchasing one for only $50 if they purchased a Magnavox television set. One myth Magnavox salesmen would tell customers, either through their own ignorance of the technology or as a deliberate strategy to entice the potential customer, was that the Odyssey would only work on Magnavox television sets. This is of course not true. Their incentive was to sell more Magnavox televisions, but these same salesmen may have kept Odyssey sales lower than they could have been. Now, buying a Magnavox television with the Odyssey and saving $50, which is roughly $300 in 2018, was a great deal for the consumer. In 1972, you could buy a 15-inch color television set for $329, and that's with the remote control. Or you could leave out the remote control and get it for a whopping $289. If you really wanted to save some green, a 12-inch black and white television would only run you $98. To adjust for inflation in 2018, just times those prices by 6. And if you already did that, you might notice how much more televisions cost 50 years ago. To be fair, the quality of appliances of all kinds decades ago was much higher than it is today. If you want proof, just compare your blender to your grandmother's that she got in 1960. That 1961 is probably still working today.
What is it?
It's a 200-year-old Volkswagen. They really built these things, didn't they?
The reason appliances don't last as long today is because it's less profitable for companies to produce products that last 40 years. There are mixed reports about how many Odyssey consoles were actually sold, but the Odyssey's product manager claims there were at 70,000 units sold in 1972. Not bad, considering it was released in September of that year. Plus, those numbers are about what Magnavox had projected for that year. The Odyssey continued selling for 3 more years through 1975. In the end, the Smithsonian Institute claims there were an estimated 350,000 units sold worldwide before Magnavox discontinued the Odyssey. The light gun that was sold separately ended up with 20,000 units picked up by consumers. Before it was discontinued, Baer proposed several add-ons, such as one that added sound to games, one that supported 4 players, as well as a putting controller that accompanied a proposed golf game. After discontinuing the Odyssey, Magnavox continued developing video game consoles and released the Odyssey 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 2000, 3000, 4000, and even an unreleased 5000 prototype. While these consoles were all released under the Magnavox brand name, the Magnavox company was actually purchased by what was at the time an unknown Dutch television manufacturer called Philips. Starting in 1976, Philips released the Odyssey 200, 2001, which is actually just an Odyssey 4000, and the 2100, which brought the same casing as the 2001. All these variations played a variety of primitive video games, such as clones to Pong and Breakout. In 1978, the Odyssey 2 was released in North America, Europe, Japan, and Brazil. It was available for $180 American and sold about 2 million units worldwide. Half of those were sold in the US, until it was discontinued in 1984. The Odyssey 2 incorporated the standard joystick that would become synonymous with the Atari 2600, the Mattel Intellivision, and the ColecoVision. Speaking of which, when am I finally going to cover those things? Soon. Very soon. By the time the Odyssey 2 sold its last unit, it marked the end of the 12th console in the Odyssey series. While many of the consoles in the Odyssey series were just single-game units for Pong, many competitors in the mid and late 1970s made clones and sold them as well. But the home gaming market wasn't the only arena where competitors were obviously cloning the Odyssey. There was at least one competitor in the new arcade market who was accused of illegally cloning the Odyssey's signature game of tennis.
The Apollo computers are manufactured by the Raytheon Company in Waltham, Massachusetts.
In 1965, U.S. defense contractor Raytheon purchased Edix Teaching Systems. The year before, Edix had developed the Knowledge Computer, a so-called teaching machine designed by Thomas Nesbitt. The Knowledge Computer was a machine that asked patrons various multiple-choice questions via a film strip located in the machine, kind of like an early electronic trivia game. Raytheon purchased Edix with the purpose of using this technology to train its military personnel. After the acquisition, Edix investor Bill Nutting took control of the machine's marketing. Nutting was assigned this marketing position probably because a year earlier he took another investor's joke about adding a coin slot on the machine literally and began trying to sell this new amusement device to bars and other places that housed other similar products like pinball machines. By January of 1966, Nutting left Raytheon and formed Nutting Associates with the intention of creating a similar machine called Computer Quiz. To make a short story long, Bill Nutting's brother Dave briefly joined him before leaving his brother's company to form his own. Computer Quiz was released by Bill Nutting's company and quickly became a huge success. And this is despite the fact that it cost $0.25 to play a single game versus other coin-operated amusements like pinball machines that only cost $0.10 at the time. In 1969, Nutting took a meeting with 2 young entrepreneurs from a company called Syzygy. The 2 entrepreneurs, Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell, were looking for a manufacturer who could produce a fiberglass cabinet with a coin slot mechanism for some kind of new type of game they had created called Computer Space. Nutting's company took the order and even entered into an agreement to market this new amusement device. To Despite grossing over $3 million, Bushnell was displeased with Nutting's marketing, insisting they should have sold more units. Shortly after 1972, Bushnell and Dabney renamed their company with a more Japanese-sounding name with what some say was the intention of sounding more exotic while trying to compete with other successful Japanese-based gaming companies operating in America. Atari Incorporated opened its first office in Sunnyvale, California in 1972. In May of that year, Bushnell got his first look at the Odyssey while visiting a Magnavox product showcase. Bushnell saw a simple tennis game that sparked inspiration in the young entrepreneur's imagination. How do we know he first saw the Odyssey in his signature tennis game at this showcase? Because he signed the guest book, that's how. And it was around this time that Allan Alcorn got one of his first assignments at Atari. Bushnell had already hired Alcorn as an engineer, and one of his first assignments was to develop Atari's own tennis game. Alcorn got to work, and it wasn't long until Atari had their first product developed under this new Atari brand. In August of 1972, Atari installed a prototype of this new game at a local Sunnyvale bar called Annie Cap's Tavern. Ironically, they placed it next to Computer Space, the game Bushnell and Dabney had developed with Bill Nutting. Within a few days, Bill Gaddis, the bar's general manager, called Bushnell to report the new game had stopped working. When Bushnell and some other Atari employees went over to repair it, it became apparent the game wasn't broken, just full of quarters, which became clear after they opened it and quarters started falling out like a waterfall. At that moment, Bushnell knew Pong was going to be a big hit around the country. The funny part of all this is that story is probably not even true. Yes, the first Pong prototype was tested at Annie Cap's Tavern in Sunnyvale. That part's true. The tray full of quarters falling out onto the floor is considered by many to just be a myth, carefully crafted by Bushnell himself. Whether it's true or not, one thing no one disputes is the fact that once Pong was officially released that November, it was a runaway hit. At the same time, Magnavox was already successfully selling Odyssey consoles, all of which featured basically the same game as Pong. One thing Ralph Baer's Odyssey version of Pong lacked was a scoring system. Bushnell and Alcorn made sure to include that in their version. And unlike Odyssey's Pong, Atari's incorporates sound. Having no sound cards available at the time, Alcorn incorporated tones that originated from the circuits of the circuit board. Comparing the technical specifications of both, the Odyssey used only 64 bytes of internal RAM, 128 bytes of video RAM, and 1024 bytes of BIOS RAM. The BIOS is the operating system. It also contained no ROM of any kind. The games worked by placing the various number cartridges into the console, which all contained a series of jumper circuits that connected the various components of the main circuit board together. Atari's Pong also worked a bit differently from what most people think of when they think of video games. Unlike video games today, Pong didn't utilize a CPU or even generate its graphics via pixels. The game works not by the use of an operating system like the Odyssey does, but instead solely by the circuit board itself. The board is comprised of 66 discrete logic chips. This method of designing and developing video games was the norm for this time. In my Wolfenstein video, I covered how id Software developed their own game engine and began licensing that out to other companies. But that practice didn't start until the mid-1990s, and it wouldn't be until the late 1970s that microprocessors became widely available for use in video games. Microprocessors will eventually make these types of logic boards obsolete, but before any of that happened, video game makers were developing circuit boards for each different game from scratch. This is why Atari's Pong arcade unit is technically not even digital. It's actually an analog game. By 1974, Sanders had been putting considerable pressure on Magnavox to go after Atari and other companies that were cloning the Odyssey's table tennis game. Being under contract as a sub-licensee for Sanders, Magnavox finally gave in to Sanders' requests and in April of 1974 began filing lawsuits against Atari, Bally, Midway, Chicago Dynamics, and Allied Leisure. Actually, time out. I forgot something. During this exact same time that Magnavox was filing these lawsuits, another lawsuit had, ironically, just gotten settled. Now, this is where things get complicated, both legally and technologically. In the fall of 1973, Allied Leisure took Midway to court, arguing that they had actually violated their copyright for, you guessed it, a Pong-like game. This is the complicated part. Midway had actually obtained a license to produce a Pong clone from Atari. Allied Leisure had not obtained a license from anyone. Both released their own respective Pong clones. Allied Leisure then developed, on their own, a 4-player version of Pong. Remember a moment ago when I discussed how at this time they were still developing games pre-microprocessors and how operating systems were not being used to run these games? Allied, who never obtained a license to produce Pong, had actually created their own circuit board for this 4-player Pong game, and Midway, who had obtained a license to produce Pong clones, copied Allied 4-player Pong game via a mechanical drawing of the circuit board. On October 18, 1973, Allied filed suit against Midway for patent infringement and also accused them of unfair competition in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. In April of 1974, the two gaming companies settled the suit before the court could even render a decision on the merits of the case. But had the case actually gone to trial, the merits discussed would have been this. Allied accused Midway of copying the circuit board for their 4-player Pong clone by creating a drawing based on the actual physical board itself. To assemble the board in production, Allied used and patented a drawing of the circuit board. The merits that probably would have been brought up include whether copying a circuit board based on an original schematic of that board violates the patent. Prior to the Copyright Act of 1976, the courts used the Copyright Act of 1909 to rule that while the drawing of the circuit board is protected by copyright, copying a piece of technology or machinery based on one's own drawing of that technology is perfectly legal. The legal argument for this involves a distinction in intellectual property law. In 1880, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Baker v. Selden that the protected printed material does not give an author the right to exclude others from practicing what was described in the printed material, only the right to exclude reproduction of the material in the printed material. In layman's terms, this means the original drawing of Allied circuit board is protected, but the actual board itself is not. This is probably why so many food recipes are kept secret and locked away in a safe. Even after the passage of the Copyright Act of 1976, legal scholars aren't even sure a circuit board like Allied's would still be protected. But why is this? In legal terms, machines or computer hardware are not ordinarily afforded copyright protection. Software, on the other hand, is. The legal reasoning behind protecting software, but not protecting the machine itself, is because software provides specific pre-programmed written instructions, whereas a circuit board doesn't technically perform its task in the same way. Legal scholars often compare it to architectural plans for buildings. The finished structure is the result of the plans, not a copy of them. This is why reverse engineering is considered a legal defense when companies develop similar products. Just look at what Compaq did in the early 1980s. Copyright does not give the author an exclusive right to build the machine.
How can you legally make an IBM clone and advertise it as exactly like an IBM?
Well, you can legally make it as long as you can persuade a judge that you haven't gone to Computerland and bought a copy of the IBM program for their BIOS and copied it. So the way you have to do that is have one person prepare a specification of what the program's supposed to do and have another person who's never seen the IBM program write a program to do it. And if you can persuade the judge that the second fellow didn't copy from the IBM code, then I think you'll be pretty safe.
Another issue this case would have brought up was unfair competition, which was a state law that I'm not going to get into. On January 31st, 1974, the facility Applied Leisure owned and operated out of suffered a major fire that resulted in extensive damage to the building and machinery inside. During this time, the American economy was also suffering, and sales of video game arcade units started to decline. While Allied was still making gains in the European market, at some point before the fire, they had ceased making games for the American market. These same economic conditions affected Midway as well, and by April, they ceased their video game production. On April 12, 1974, Midway has settled with Allied, and on that same day, Magnavox filed suit against Atari. They argue that Atari and the other companies infringed on Ralph Baer's patents to the Odyssey's table tennis game. If you're wondering what's actually happening right now, let me break it down. Ralph Baer developed what would be the Odyssey and a signature table tennis game while at Sanders Associates during the late 1960s. Magnavox eventually agreed to manufacture and distribute the Odyssey under the Magnavox brand. Nolan Bushnell, who had just formed the Atari company, witnessed a demonstration of the Odyssey in May of 1972, a few months prior to the Odyssey's September release date. Bushnell left the demo and tasked Allan Alcorn to create a similar, yet improved version of the table tennis game. It's reported that Bushnell just wanted this table tennis program to serve as a practice exercise. However, I find it hard to believe that Bushnell would have wanted Alcorn to devote so much time and resources to just a practice program. 2 months after the Odyssey was released, Atari released the new arcade game Pong. While similar, there were some drastic differences between the two table tennis games. The Odyssey used a BIOS, or operating system, to execute the program. Atari's Pong didn't use any software or operating system of any kind. It executed its program through 66 chips that included both sound effects and a scoring system, which the Odyssey's table tennis did not. Atari then licensed Midway to develop Pong clones. Allied Leisure then took a legally licensed Midway-produced circuit board and copied it. Allied, without holding a license from either Midway or Atari, released their own Pong clone using the copied circuit board. They then modified that copy board and legitimately created a new board, 80% of which was identical to Midway's circuit board, which was 100% identical to Atari's. But Allied added chips that created a 4-player version of Pong. Midway then copied Allied's circuit board for a 4-player Pong and released it themselves. Where have I seen this scenario before?
Pat, there's good leg.
While Atari had achieved more success than their fellow arcade competitors, they were financially ill-equipped to handle a lawsuit with a major corporation that could have resulted in $2 million in legal fees. Even though Atari felt like they had the upper hand legally, they certainly didn't have the capital required to go through with a lawsuit. In June of 1976, Atari ended up paying Magnavox $700,000 and accepted an offer to be a licensee of Magnavox. Atari's competitors, who were also named in the suit, were not given such a good offer and were forced to pay royalties to Magnavox. The settlement with Atari also granted Magnavox the rights to any products Atari released for 1 year, but Nolan Bushnell's answer to that was to just not release anything for 366 days. But why did the courts rule the way they did? Without getting into too much detail, copyright law in the United States has undergone several changes. The Copyright Act of 1790 was the first federal copyright law in the Americas. The 1710 British Statute of Anne did not apply to the American colonies. Prior to the American Revolution, only 3 copyright laws have been passed in the colonies. The initial Federal Copyright Act protects maps, charts, and books for a period of 14 years. The possibility of the copyright holder to obtain an additional 14-year term should that person still be alive. Remember what the quality of life was like in the 17 and 1800s.
Bring out your dead. Here's one. 9pence. I'm not dead. What?
In 1831, a revision of the law added musical compositions to the list of protected works and changed the initial 14-year term to a 28-year term. But the renewed second term remained at 14 years. Life expectancy still sucked back then.
I'm not dead. Yeah. He says he's not dead. Yes, he is. I'm not. He isn't? Well, he will be soon. He's very ill. I'm getting better. No, you're not. You'll be stone dead in a moment.
In 1870, another revision was passed. This act empowered the Patent Office to resolve disputes between the first to invent and the first to file.
And what is it you want to patent, Herr Smith?
I call it Smith's theory of relativity.
Hey, look at this.
What?
It also allowed translations of works into other languages to be covered, which previously had not been. The 1909 Copyright Act came in part to a December 1905 speech President Theodore Roosevelt gave to Congress, urging for a more complete revision on how copyright protection worked in the United States. 4 years later, the largest copyright revision since 1790 was passed. This law gave more time in copyright extensions to an additional 28 years after the initial 28-year copyright period. Life expectancy still sucked back then. Just ask Upton Sinclair. This 1909 Act also gave more protection in the form of a mechanical license to musical artists who wish to record already copyrighted songs on a new medium that is shown off regularly by hipsters these days. This provision was intended to protect piano rolls, but was later applied to records as well. Over the years, various amendments were added that gave protection to motion pictures and foreign authors. This was the copyright law that was in effect during the Odyssey Atari rulings. In 1976, after the rulings, a new Copyright Act was passed that is currently still in effect today. This 1976 Act was intended to cover copyright in the new emerging world of computer technology. This was supposed to solve the problems surrounding creators of computer software. This 1976 Act also incorporated, for the first time, the fair use doctrine, which allows copyrighted works to be used in the context of news reporting, research, or teaching. And because life expectancy was a bit better now, a static 75-year term was implemented, with the 1998 amendment further extending that protection to cover the entire author's life, plus an additional 70 years, and works of corporate authorship to either 120 years after creation or 95 years after publication.
I feel happy. I feel happy. Ah, thanks very much. Touch off. See you on Thursday. Right.
So, after that little seminar on the history of copyright law, I guess it's over, right? The courts ruled on who actually invented Pong, at least legally, But who is actually responsible for inventing Pong? Well, Pong story short... Okay, sorry. But seriously, who invented it? Well, Pong specifically, I would say was developed by Nolan, Bushnell, and Allan Alcorn. The Pong-like game on the Odyssey was technically not called Pong. Atari's Pong was clearly inspired from Ralph Baer in the Odyssey. But what if I told you Ralph Baer was inspired from someone else? In a previous episode, I covered what the first video game was. One contender was Tennis for Two, which was programmed with a missile trajectory system on an oscilloscope. William Higinbotham was the programmer, but it was only available for a couple of two-week periods at a public exhibition hosted by the Brookhaven National Laboratory in 1958 and 1959. For more on Tennis for Two and other early video games, check out my prior episode on the first video game. Is it possible Ralph Baer ever saw this demo in either 1958 or 59?
How ironic.
No, that's not ironic. Ironic would be if we had to work together to hurt each other.
No, ironic would be, instead of that guy kidnapping Lopez, Lopez kidnapped him.
I think it would be ironic if our guns didn't shoot bullets, but instead squirted a healing salve that cured all wounds.
I think it would be ironic if everyone was made of iron.
While that's a possibility, there's no evidence he actually saw them. And don't forget that the Odyssey table tennis game was developed long after the Odyssey project was even in the development phase, with Harrison and Roosh contributing as well. Now, Higinbotham could have patented his table tennis game, but he never did. Remember that during the late 1950s, the idea of computer games was still in utero, so to speak. Higinbotham probably didn't see the potential of patenting computer games. So legally, Ralph Baer holds a patent for a play-controlled hitting symbol. It's two patents of Baer's that really tip the courts in his favor. There's a general one that describes player-controlled objects on a video monitor, then there's the second one that goes into more detail, describing how the Odyssey specifically uses an operating system to have two dots collide with one another, resulting in one of the dots bouncing off. In my opinion, Higinbotham invented the idea of playing table tennis on an electronic device. Remember, an oscilloscope doesn't actually output a video signal, so it's technically not a video game. Unlike Ralph Baer's Odyssey, which does output a video signal to a television and uses an operating system, or BIOS, to execute a program. Now, Nolan, Bushnell, and Allan Alcorn dramatically improved on this table tennis game, but their Pong arcade didn't execute a program through an operating system or BIOS. So, when asked who invented Pong, that's my answer. I would compare the question to asking who invented the automobile. George Selden filed a patent for what we would describe as an automobile in 1879, but Henry Ford perfected the assembly line factory that resulted in a boom for the automobile industry. But Ford had to sue the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers after being twice denied a license to manufacture automobiles from the Selden patent. Allan represented Selden and issued licenses for his patent at the time, and denied Ford a license because he had already bankrupted two previous automobile companies. Ford made the bold decision to go ahead and manufacture automobiles without a Selden license. While I'm actually omitting 95% of the details of Ford's story, in the end Ford came out victorious, and his name and company are much more associated with the early automobile industry despite not having invented it. One additional lawsuit worth mentioning occurred in 1985 when Nintendo sued in an effort to invalidate Baer's patents on account of William Higinbotham's Tennis for Two game developed in 1958. But Nintendo proved unsuccessful after the courts determined Higinbotham's game worked through an oscilloscope, which unlike Ralph Baer's patent, worked by transmitting video signals, which oscilloscopes do not. After the initial lawsuits, Baer continued inventing games and toys. One of his most notable was an electronic memory game Milton Bradley released in 1978 called Simon. Baer worked with Howard Morrison, Lenny Cope, and Charles Capps to develop Simon. On an amusing side note, Milton Bradley debuted Simon at Studio 54, which was an old TV studio turned nightclub. I imagine patrons of Studio 54 loved interacting with the electronic memory game, especially after doing, kids, that guy probably has really bad sinuses.
I need an adult! I need an adult!
In 1983, Baer retired from Sanders Associates and formed Axiom LLC with Bob Belasits. Baer spent the next 30 years inventing and marketing games and toys. On December 6, 2014, Ralph Baer passed away. By the time of his death, he had over 150 patents to his name. Some of his less notable work includes developing submarine tracking systems and electronic greeting cards.
The 2004 National Medal of Technology is awarded to Ralph H. Baer for his groundbreaking and pioneering creation, development, and commercialization of interactive video games, which spawned related uses, applications, and industries in both the entertainment and education realms.
Prior to his death, Baer had been inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame and received the National Medal of Technology. Many people will debate who the father of video games is. Without a doubt, Ralph Baer is a prime contender, but no one person could really take that title. There are just too many people who contributed to the field of developing video games, naming just one would be disingenuous to all the others. But Ralph Baer's story is one that sets him apart from many of the others. Born into a Jewish family in 1920s Germany, he escaped and made a life for himself in America, patriotically serving his country in World War II and earning an education post-war through the GI Bill. His work in the field of technology brought joy to many people. Well, that's it for this episode of The Bearded Nerd. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click the thumbs up if you liked the video and to subscribe to keep up with future videos. See you next time.
Up, there's a good leg. Stand down! Stand down!
Tie him up, tape him up, hands and face.
On the floor!
Bend over the f***ing desk. Keys. I want keys. Now. I'll find you.
Of course you will, sweetheart.
I'll find you.
Do you think this is f***ing hide and seek?
Your stupidity might be your one saving grace.
Huh?
Don't me, Greek boy. How is it your stupid, soon-to-be dead friends thought that they might be able to steal my cannabis and then sell it back to me? Is this a declaration of war? Is this some white that black don't get? Because I'm not laughing, Nicholas. I know you couldn't have known my position, because you're not that stupid that if you did, you wouldn't have turned up here scratching your ass with that "what's going on here" look slapped all over your Chevy Chase. But what you do know is where these people live. If you hold back anything, I'll kill you. If you bend the truth, or I think you're bending the truth, I'll kill you. If you forget anything, I'll kill you. In fact, you're gonna have to work very hard to stay alive, Nick. Now, do you understand everything I've said? Because if you don't, I'll kill you.
You got something here for me, have you? Come on. Chop, chop.
doing here? What the f are you doing here?